Right, well, good evening everyone, and welcome to the second of my Gresham College lectures for this year. And it's interesting to see it hasn't attracted quite as many people as the audience for my first lecture, which was about murder inquiries. And I'm making the assumption that clearly demonstrates that if you have sex and violence in the abstract, then you attract a bigger audience. So I shall bear that in mind for future lectures. Tonight I'm going to turn my attention to the more traditional, but potentially no less deadly, water theme of flooding. Both murders and flooding include death and uncertainty. And I want to, in particular, to explore such questions as, are the catastrophic summer 2007 floods in the English Midlands and the recent events of southeast England harbingers of worse things to come, particularly as the climate shifts? What are the odds that will conspire to put London underwater during the next few years? And does flooding pose a major challenge to the UK's security? I'm going to review some of the UK's recent experiences, and then I'm going to consider whether science, technology and collaboration can actually reduce our vulnerability to floods, or whether actually we're wasting our time and we're doomed to more death and destruction. We do know that flooding is a dark and wicked problem, and it's important that we have that in mind when we take decisions on how to protect ourselves, or otherwise, if that's what we choose to do. These are not abstract things, but they have a very real impact. And capturing that, particularly if you've not experienced extreme flooding yourself, can be quite challenging. So I'm going to start off by playing you an extract from a disaster movie. And forgive me, those of you who are disaster movie aficionados have seen this before, but it's a simulation, little extract simulating an individual experience. As I suggested in my last lecture, several times actually in my last lecture, if you are of a nervous disposition, then avert your eyes now. Anybody know the film? Okay. It's about London, as we shall see in a minute.
Biscuit instead. There's water pouring through the doors.
Okay, I think you might agree with me that that's a fairly terrifying prospect. And I think I'd like you to just keep that last image of the house in your mind, because we shall actually see something very similar in a minute or two.
The 1 o'clock in the morning, like I was in bed. I had a very low bed, you know, lower than this. And I woke up, well, not woke up, I was asleep, and I just put my arm out the bed like into icy cold water. Of course, that gave me a start, you know. And I shook my husband and said we were flooded or something. and he just grabbed hold of the baby and me, and we all sort of tried to swim out the house, and the water was coming up and up all the time. And we got out into the garden, and there's an old chicken shed there. So he put me on the chicken shed with the baby, and his mum was screaming for help because she lived next door, see. So he said, I'll go and try to rescue Mum. He put me on the chicken shed and the baby, and went and tried to break in and get his mum, you know. Well, he got his mum out and dragged her along to the chicken shed. She couldn't get on it because she was 22 stone, you know. So she just stood there in the water, and I stood there holding the baby and holding her hand in the water. And then some neighbours was up in the loft up just at the back of us, so he said, I'll go up, try to get up there and see if I can get a blanket to cover the baby up, because we had no clothes on the time. We'd struggled out the house with all the furniture floating about. So cold, kept calling out for help. Didn't seem to be nobody around. And then all of a sudden I heard a terrible, my mother-in-law went first. She let go of my hand and she was gone, floated away like. And then I heard a terrible screaming. When I looked where my husband was gone, I didn't know where he was gone till after the hospital business. And then I sat there another 3 hours, you know, keep on getting on people's furniture as it floated by and trying to keep me and the baby up out the water. Mickey Saunders, that's the man who rescued me, he had a rubber dinghy. He said he'd been trying to get the boats from Lee. They couldn't get them or something. They put me in this rubber dinghy and the baby and took us up to the end of the road and put us in an old army lorry or some lorry like that and put a tarpaulin over us because we had no clothes on, you know. And we went to Rochford Hospital. And just as we got in Rochford, I didn't know at the time, but my baby died as got in the gate, but I didn't know. They didn't tell me that till afterwards.
That's the 1953 flooding of the Thames Estuary. It is indeed somebody from Canvey Island talking. Again, it's a pretty shocking story, and it's difficult for us to relate to. And I do want to say this, make the same point actually as I made in my last lecture, that we're dealing with a dark story here, but please, you are allowed to chuckle if it's appropriate, of course. I want just to play you one more little extract. This is a piece of American newsreel that was taken about the flooding of 1953, and their focus of the main part of the focus was on the flooding in Europe, but towards the end of the newsreel they did touch on the UK. So most of the extract concerns the UK here.
In England, as in Holland, the rich Kentish farmlands suffer untold damage to soil and livestock. The toll in shipping alone will run into millions of dollars as commercial and naval vessels are flung ashore. The entire coast of East Anglia is littered with the hulks. As the storm spends its fury, Britain and the Low Countries take stock. An estimated 2,000 dead, 1 million homeless, property damage that will take months to assess. A cataclysm that will be recorded in history.
Now, there may be people here who can remember the 1953 flooding. Actually, I can't, but let's just say who can remember that flooding? Oh, about a third of the audience, perhaps. Okay, let's switch from the particular to the general for a minute. Flooding is one of the world's largest problems, and in recent reviews this one's by the World Economic Forum, flood hazard appears near the top of global economic risks. We've got, let's go back. We've got towards the top, top of the diagram here, we've got water crises. Now, what we've got here up the side of the diagram here is the impact. So up here we've got high impact, and down here we've got low impact. And across the bottom we've got low likelihood of occurring through, on the right, to high likelihood of occurring. So you can see that a water crisis is regarded as both high impact and very likely to occur. Now, most of that is taken up with drought, which is going to be the subject of my next lecture. in a few weeks' time. But extreme weather events are certainly very likely to occur, and in fact flooding is picked up in some of the other dots on this diagram as well. So what we're dealing with is something that is very significant internationally. It's very likely to happen and has significant economic impact. And in fact, in combination with failure to adapt to climate change, which is something I'll return to later, it is a very nasty business. Now, we've already seen it's a risk to life and limb, it's a risk to the infrastructure that maintains our standard of living, and to the production of our food, to housing, to businesses, to our health service, and to, not least, perhaps to the insurance industry in the city, to name just a few elements. Not only is it expensive, and of course the price depends, at least in part, on how we cost a human life. How much would that baby be worth, for example, that the lady was talking about? Or how much is an elderly person or a poor person, and so on, actually worth? How much are they valued at? So how we cost a particular event requires decisions on those kind of things. But it's also relatively frequent, and somewhere in the world experiences catastrophic flooding every few weeks or months. Most of you will remember this one, I'm sure. This is the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 that followed a fault line shift in the Earth's crust. It's estimated to have killed about 300,000 people around the Indian Ocean, and disproportionately women and children. I actually was told personal stories in India about how people on the Indian coastline saw the wave coming and they ran inland towards a road embankment, carrying the children that were too young to walk. But they couldn't carry all the children, so the toddlers who were just walking and the older people were left behind, and they had to be abandoned. And people there typically have large families. So that was clearly disastrous for them. This one, you may remember as well. This is the result of a magnitude 9 earthquake 80-odd miles off the east coast of Tohoku in Japan. It took place at 5:45 on the 11th of March 2011 and created a tsunami, a coastal flooding wave, which you can see in the rather spectacular picture there. That was actually the most powerful earthquake to hit Japan in recorded history. And this wave, which was up to 10 metres in height, developed on the coastal shelf, and the devastation was terrific. And of course, courtesy of mobile phone footage, and some of you may remember this on the news reports, you saw the dreadful spectacle of cars being rolled over and people dying in front of our eyes, filmed by people a little bit higher up. The wave propagated across the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and was experienced as far away as New Zealand. About 16,000 people died in Japan, and of course it was followed by the Fukushima nuclear meltdown that was also significant and expensive. More predictably, perhaps, but similarly expensive, was the flooding following Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans in America, where again a storm surge drove up to 6 miles inland and is reported as creating over 50 breaches in what everybody at the time was reliably saying were flood-proof levees, barriers along the delta of the Mississippi in Louisiana. Now, most of you probably know what storm surges are. They are a combination of high tides, large waves, low atmospheric pressure and driving winds, and it forces water into narrowing estuaries and deltas where they overwhelm areas of land. Property damage in this particular instance was estimated at £71 billion by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And despite the activity of the US Corps of Engineers, the fact is that about half of New Orleans is lower than sea level. So actually, any breach of defences was going to be catastrophic, even without what later emerged to be a legacy of poor construction and inadequate maintenance, a disaster waiting to happen, if you like. We should keep that in mind when we think about what we spend on our own coastal defences, I think. There was, of course, a lot of criticism afterwards of the management arrangements, about the forecasting, and many of you will remember there were huge problems with evacuation. People were left in a stadium. There were casualties everywhere, not dealt with. And the death rate there, the death toll there, was between about 1,000 and 2,000 inhabitants. And it's interesting that we don't actually know how many people died in that instance. It's part of the difficulty is enumerating those people who are more likely to be poor and dispossessed. 2,000 inhabitants then died, perhaps. Now that truly appalling event pales into insignificance in comparison with the flooding of the Yangtze River in central China in 1931, and probably there's nobody here that can remember that, but there was very heavy rain, snow melt and cyclones, and it's estimated that between 1 million and 4 million people were drowned. I mean, that's just really beyond our ready comprehension. Now, turning to the UK, a picture of Katrina there, the sort of thing we saw in the States. And I should say, if we turn to the UK, we're not actually on a seismically active area. This is, if there are any school children in the audience, this is the so-called Pacific Ring of Fire. We've got deadly earthquakes over here. We haven't got anything much around the UK. But we too have had tsunami, probably, albeit small and rather infrequently. And there are certainly reports of a tsunami in 1607, about quite precise reports actually, of about 9 o'clock on the 30th of January 1607, for example. There are records of huge and mighty hills of water rushing up the Severn Estuary, far larger than the typical Severn bore, and wiping out again up to around 2,000 people, estimated, about the same as Hurricane Katrina. And together with their livestock, you can see them in the picture there, the people, the cattle, the horses and so on. It also, it's been researched in some depth actually, and people have identified that the salt marsh in the estuary was actually eroded. The power of the water was enough to erode part of the coastline. I will just show you this is taken from the Monmouth News in 1607, and the quotes there are interesting. I will just read them out for the benefit of the readers, listeners subsequently. It says, "The aforesaid waters, having gathered over their wonted limits, are affirmed to have run with a swiftness so incredible that no greyhound could have escaped by running before them, and they yet cover 24 miles in length." Then there's quite a lot more detail in the news report, but then it says, "Mistress Van, a gentlewoman of good sort, is vouched before she could get up into the higher rooms of her house, having marked the approach of the waters, to have been surprised by them, her house being distant above 4 miles from the sea." Does that not take your mind back to the first video clip I showed of the lady trying to climb up to the roof of her house? Mistress Van tried to climb onto her roof, but she drowned. There were no rescue helicopters or emergency services, of course, and so she, a gentlewoman of good sort, actually, as it says in the report, with an income of over £100, tried to climb to the top of her house. Her wealth didn't protect her. Now, of course, for some people, flooding provides business opportunities. And just in case... Oh, sorry, I'll skip that one, actually. Just in case you forget about those business opportunities, I just want to draw your attention to a rather distasteful advertisement, the one on the left, actually. It's from a US insurance company that insures householders against natural disasters, and it clearly draws upon the same iconography and the same human fears as our disaster movie. I'm not sure whether Noah's Ark I would regard as an advertising material, but whatever the stories that it tells of our fears of flooding. In terms of that human misery, flooding's been a significant problem throughout human history, and it's featured in diaries and newspaper reports and paintings and poetry and so on. It can clearly be absolutely terrifying when it occurs quickly. But even the very slow rising waters or temporary shallow inundation can create long-standing problems that are quite difficult to characterise for mental health, for example, if your house is flooded, or for the stability of buildings. Now, if we recall that catastrophic flooding in eastern England on the 31st of January, several of those characteristics could be seen and heard. The lady who, in the video extract, was talking about her live experience 60 years earlier when the water level reached 5 or 6 metres above average, with waves on top of that. And of course, there were many other experiences in Lincolnshire, East Anglia, the Netherlands and Belgium and so on, as we saw in the sound file. In total, in that event, as I said, 2,000 people in mainland Europe died around the North Sea, about 300 people in the UK, unfortunately, not your relative. So, the issue there was, and in most of these cases, was that low-lying communities were unaware of the imminent threat of a storm surge, and the coastal barriers had been neglected in the face of other priorities, and no systematic warning systems existed. Now, despite that, actually 32,000 people were successfully evacuated from Canvey Island and around the Thames Estuary, and the economic damage was much less than you might think, perhaps a couple of £1 billion at today's value, and largely because people owned less than they do today. So the more we own, the more the flood is going to cost. In addition, today we have much better coastal flood forecasting. The Met Office say that their forecasting from 2 to 5 days ahead is pretty accurate. You might say, well, wouldn't they? I couldn't comment, but allegedly it is more accurate. And that is within the environmental parameters that we know about today. So with current climates, current sea levels, and so on. But we are, of course, still reliant on those coastal barriers, very reliant on those coastal barriers. Now, flooding has other causes, and each has its own characteristics. We've had many, many other floods. Some of you might remember the flooding in Lynmouth in 1952. Again, I deny responsibility, I don't remember that. It was a very serious event, but much more recently we've had things like Boscastle in Cornwall, we've had Carlisle in 2005, we had a whole bunch of places in Cornwall in 2010, a lot of areas in the UK in 2012 and 2013, and in 2014, where was it? Somerset, the Somerset levels. I talked about the Somerset levels in one of my previous lectures, so I'm not going to dwell on that today, but not so far in London, at least not extensively. I say that with some trepidation because as I drafted this lecture earlier this week, we have had very heavy rainfall actually this week, stormy weather, and I felt that it was quite possible that the currency of my talk might be overtaken by events, but fortunately not. Now, the most obvious thing to say is clearly flooding usually follows periods of inclement weather, where water from rivers, streams, fields, paved areas and so on, the ground, and indeed from sewers, ends up in places where it's not usually to be found. So we read about rivers bursting their banks, which actually they never do, or the sea breaking through defences and overtopping them. Now, the main cause of flood damage in the UK is from rivers. We call that fluvial flooding. If you look at this particular diagram, this is a diagram of flood events in Europe between 1998 and 2008, so it's about a decade of flood events. You can see the key there, basically the darker the colour, the more the event. So the central UK has had quite a few floods, nothing like the floods to the north of Greece, southeast Europe, and so on. That's a pretty intense area. But it puts our own flooding into perspective. We are actually quite seriously affected by flooding. The main cause of that flood damage, as I said, is flooding from rivers. In it works out at approximately £500 million of insured damage per year. And coastal damage is about another 320 million, a third of a billion by contrast. And that's assuming, of course, that the Thames Barrier and the associated embankments continue to operate efficiently and effectively. So flooding from rivers then £500 million a year, coastal damage £250 million a year, surface water about £250 million per year, and groundwater or clear water flooding about a further £210 million a year. So that's the sort of balance. That latter is obviously mainly in areas of permeable rocks, chalks, limestones and so on, some sandstones. So Ulster, Scotland, for example, will escape that. There are a few areas where rising groundwater creates problems. Again, I don't know if you're aware of that, but we use less groundwater now than we did in the past. And in the meantime, we have built houses in areas where there used in the past to be groundwater. So we've dried out the ground, built the houses, and stopped now using the groundwater. So it doesn't take a particularly bright person to work out what the implications of that might be. The groundwater is rising up again under areas like London, Birmingham, and some other big cities as well. So I'm going to return to those estimates in a minute because they are, I might say, confounded by uncertainties. Of course, it's very important that we understand these figures and those uncertainties because that's the basis on which we take decisions on what to do about flooding. So here we've got the Thames Barrier, and you can clearly see in the pictures also the embankments, the walls along the Thames that run up into London and some distance below London as well. It's interesting which areas of London, of course, are protected by the barrier itself. It's the expensive bits, of course, not those bits of Canby Island and so on that were affected in 1953. Now, in practice, of course, these different kinds of floods, and we've got them on here, and the figures there, the river flooding, the coastal flooding, the surface water flooding, and the groundwater flooding, those different kind of events, they all have different characteristics. And of course, in practice, in any one flood event, it's very difficult to work out what's actually happened. I'm going to just briefly reflect on the 2007 flooding in the Severn, because it's one that I know quite a bit about. This was part of a wider event across England and Wales, in which only 13 people died. I say only 13, that's clearly 13 too many. Several of them actually were electrocuted trying to connect heaters and things while standing in water, which is a rather silly thing to do. But fortunately, those 13, that is a much lower number than died in a very similar event in 1947. Now, many of you will recall these kind of photographs. This is Tewkesbury Abbey, surrounded by water lapping into the graveyard, almost into the crypt in the bottom photograph there. Shops, houses, streets, stations, roads, and so on, flooded, in some cases to very considerable depths. Now, this was a very unusual event, triggered by a very prolonged wet period and then an intense period of frontal rainfall. And it's important for a number of reasons, this particular event. The Chief Constable of Gloucestershire at the time said it was the largest UK peacetime emergency we've seen. I think that's probably not true because of the 1952 flooding. But there were relatively few deaths, but the key thing which came out of this was in a modern society, which in 1953, the East Coast events, actually a lot of that society was not very well connected, not very modern. In this particular case, lots of our infrastructure was connected together in terms of its communications. And we had what turned out to be critical points of failure. So the most critical point of failure in this particular instance was the water supply for very large area of that part of England, southwest England. 400,000 people lost their water supply for up to 21 days because the treatment plant flooded. Now, actually, if you're living in the middle of a city and you lose your water supply, it's fine for a few hours, but after that, things get pretty nasty pretty quickly. And apart from the fact that you can't flush the lavatory, which is the most serious thing, and you've got potentially nothing to drink, and you can't wash properly, it causes real emergencies. In this case, those emergencies were dealt with by bringing in the military, drafting in water bowsers from halfway across Europe, and taking on huge amounts of bottled water from elsewhere in the UK. The reason I know about this was because I was the technical advisor to the Gloucestershire County Council after the event. And what's important about this event, apart from the damage it caused, was that it triggered a change in the law, and that's important. The fact that an investigation went on which led to changes in the way we manage flooding and much more responsibility being vested with local people, county councils and district councils, to deal with flooding rather than national responses. That was important. The investigation was undertaken by Sir Michael Pitt, reported in 2008. Now, that was important. It also led to a big boost in science funding, actually, for this area, which we'll return to in a minute. In practice, our understanding of flood events is provisional because we don't really know what happens in any one place. This is a small river basin in the middle of Gloucester. You can see what happened to it during the course of that event. It was flooded deeply. There were new houses had been built near the bottom of where the ring is there. New houses had been built there, and then people wondered why suddenly they flooded in 2007. It's largely because there were a huge amount of houses had also been built upstream, and the water went straight into those houses. Now, the problem is that when you get flooded, your first priority is not, of course, filling in a questionnaire from the council about your experience, about whether your house has flooded, and that's not what you do when you've got a metre of water and sewage in your living room, or the legacy of that. So you don't tend to think about where did the water come from, or where did it go to, or was it river water or groundwater or surface water or all of them. And you actually, at that stage, you don't even know how much it's going to cost you. So we have to bear in mind that all the information that we use when we try to work out what goes on in a flood event is very, very uncertain, right down to saying, did it flood or not? Some people declare that their houses didn't flood when they did because they're worried about the insurance implications. Some do the reverse because they want to make a claim. So they go and throw the TV in the road, and then it's all wet, and then they make a claim for a new television. So data is very, very uncertain. And remember, of course, as I said before, that the biggest impact in this instance was not the inundation, but the loss of the water supply. Because if you've lost your water supply and you have no toilets, you can't run a business, even if your own property wasn't flooded. And that affected a lot of people. You can't run a hospital, a care home, a day nursery, a school, a university, or any of those things. It cost about £3.8 billion. That was the insured damage losses. Probably actually a lot more. So those kind of uncertainties are important. Now, where are those uncertainties? Where do they come from? Well, there are lots of different ones. I won't just pick off the first one at the moment. I've said a bit about the problems of establishing why something happened, or actually what happened and where. That's a pretty important thing. As we run down this list, I'll come back to some of the others in a minute. But just looking at the physical data, how do we know how much rain there was? Well, we're often dependent on this basic instrument, which is a standard meteorological office rain gauge. That's still the basic data collection point on rainfall for much of what we do. Today, a lot of them are electric, they have power supplies, they transmit their data in real time. They don't have to be read every day and so on. We also have satellite imagery now, and we have radar on the ground. This is the dish at Chilbolton. And that data, satellite data, is getting much better. The resolution of that data is getting much better all the time. So whereas before we had pictures that look like this, we now, today, this is an old image, we have pictures that look like this. That's what actually happened, probably. So we're getting much closer with radar data to finding out exactly what happened. And that's, of course, the basis on which to start being able to forecast. You have to know what happened in a particular event, at least afterwards, and preferably before, to be able to understand it. We also have... So this is what we think happened in that rainstorm over the lower Severn Valley in 2007, and those figures down the side there are some indication of what we think happened in terms of intensities. And it suggests that the blue there is the heaviest rainfall. We think it was an event that might have happened about once every 400 years on average. But the data is uncertain, and some of those rain gauges will have overflowed before they could be read. We also have quite a bit of data now, lots of data really, on the monitoring of river levels. So we have gauges that record the level of the water. This is kind of electronic gizmo that records the level of the water. If we know the velocity of the water and we can measure that at different times, we can convert the level to the actual flow of water in cubic meters per second. There's some uncertainties associated with that, but we can do that. And we have a growing set of records for that. So we can start to picture things like this. So this is the biggest flood in every year since 1972, right in the middle of that blue part on the diagram on the previous map. If you see the ring at the end there, the level there is the one that was recorded, that highest flood in 2007, and these are the floods every year, much lower. So it was clearly a pretty unusual event. But again, you're going to need statistical jiggery-pokery to get from what might be normal or more normal to establish something that's very extreme. In this particular instance, we get quite straightforward. We can calculate what happens after rainfall, which is the histogram here, and what happens to the river flow. It goes up and down like that. The so-called hydrograph goes up and down like that. In this case, the flow is about 10 cubic meters per second, and this is the rainfall every hour or so in that period in July. That's how we do start to build simple models, but we need to go a bit further than that. And in fact, when we do the arithmetic on frequency, or what we call return periods, we do indeed find that very extreme diagram that I showed you turns out to have a return period probably around once in 1,000 years, whereas elsewhere in the catchment it's maybe once in 200 years or once in 400 years, something like that. By moving away from the centre of that dark blue area on the map, we're getting down to once in 25 years. Now, it's a pretty extreme event, and it raises some interesting questions. If it's an event we can expect only once in 1,000 years, why do we want to do anything about it at all? Because it's very, very unusual. Well, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but let me just turn for a minute to what we might do about it, and things that we can start to look at in terms of generalising from that information. Now, we can try and protect ourselves against flooding. We can try and keep out the water. That's one of the simplest things we can do. We can build a dam or a barrier along the riverbank. It could be permanent, could be temporary. On the River Severn, they tried temporary barriers, and then they discovered they couldn't get them to the river because the roads had flooded and they were keeping them some distance away, and so that caused a problem. We can flood-proof. We can build a wall, a barrier. We can put sandbags around a house. That's also pretty difficult, actually. We tend to find that sandbags if we use them, are grabbed by the richer and fitter and stronger people, leaving their neighbours unprotected. And of course, also, you can't protect much in terms of a row of terraced houses with sandbags, because the water will simply come in from the sides. So they don't work very well. We can build diversion channels. Some of you may be familiar with the Jubilee River, which is a diversion channel which protects Eton, but not Slough, interestingly. That's a surface one. In Tokyo, they have some terrifying ones that are actually underground. Enormous tunnels that drop down and go under the city and out somewhere else, reliant on enormous pumps. Can't imagine what happens if the electricity supply fails, but of course it never will. We can dredge river channels deeper, but of course the river will always require some maintenance, and many people regard that as an assault on the river. We can try to reduce the amount of water running off surrounding areas of the river basin, perhaps by planting lots of trees or by stimulating the growth of peat in upland catchments. That acts like a sponge to hold the water back. We can try and put in permeable paving in towns. We can alter the way we cultivate the land. Where I live, the farmer got a very clear signal that he shouldn't cultivate spring onions on steep hills behind adjacent houses, because as soon as it rains in the summer, the water ends up in people's kitchens. That kind of approach, that managing the water, is sometimes called a SUDS, Sustainable Drainage System. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's a very important weapon in our armoury. We can also use, if you like, sacrificial areas of land. We can flood one place to protect another. That's popular with those protected, but less popular with those who are not, of course. You can use sluices and so on, and channels to try and store water temporarily in one place and allow the rest to continue downstream in smaller amounts. So those kind of approaches, they're all called structural approaches. Now, the other way we can manage flooding is to say, well, we're not going to do anything about the water, but we're going to manage it by economic means. So we can say to people who get flooded or live in areas that might be flooded, we can say, well, it's fine, you'll get flooded, but we'll insure you. Okay, you can get flood insurance, or we can do it the other way round. Actually, we can say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to insure you, to encourage you not to live there. You know, there are two ways of thinking about that. We can insure through the state. Government can say, we will help if you're flooded. And that does happen. People get emergency relief. That's what happened in Canvey Island. It was pretty minimal, but people got some sort of emergency relief. A tarpaulin over Our Lady in the back of the wagon, and as she took her dying baby to hospital. That is some form of relief, emergency relief. At the moment, we're in the middle of a system of renegotiating a system of insurance called Flood Re, which is big in the city at the moment. It's the subject of very difficult discussions. It's been the subject of quite a lot of interest in Private Eye, actually, which if you subscribe to that, because it's quite expensive, the people that run it are quite well paid, and it's a way of kind of top slicing other insurance companies to ensure that everybody can have some insurance. Okay, now what makes this a wicked problem is that these things all have unintended consequences. Most of them mean that the problem is solved in one place but not somewhere else. So the structural problems, for example, route the water somewhere else, so it becomes someone else's problem, which, if you manage this at local level, is actually quite problematic, because if the water's not in your area, you're sorted, but your next door neighbour may not be, or your next door council may not be. If we dredge rivers or straighten them to try and speed the water through, it's going to be worse downstream. And it causes ecological problems as well, and that raises tempers amongst politicians, and in the case of the Somerset levels, that reached quite extreme situations, with a lot of politicians saying unpleasant things about each other. Insurance systems can leave poor people in worse situations than they were beforehand because it encourages private rather than state responsibility, and they may not have the money to pay the premium in the first place, so they then end up worse because some people are protected but they are not. And all of those methods, as I said, encourage people to develop land on floodplains and to live there and to use them intensively. And unless we are extremely vigilant about our planning system, what we actually allow on floodplains, then we're going to be in trouble. If people are somehow encouraged to live on floodplains, there will inevitably be disasters because some level of flooding at high level is a statistical certainty. At some time, in some place, whether or not it's the defences are going to be overtopped, or because they're a larger event than the defences were designed for, or because the technology has failed, we didn't maintain it, or we got the calculations wrong, or whatever it might be. Now, the other reason that things are problematic is that is the changing picture of climate change. Climate change is a very visible, I would say, a very visible elephant in a potentially damp room. It's going to have a major effect on our future experience of flooding in the UK. There is a new report out this week, literally just out the last few days. It's not an easy read. I'm going to just tell you one or two of the highlights from it, but it is actually, I think, a really excellent analysis. It was produced for the Climate Change Risk Assessment of 2012, and it's a synthesis, I would say a remarkable synthesis, actually, and it makes for some very disturbing reading. Now, the Paris climate change negotiations are at the moment trying to secure agreement on the global level of carbon dioxide emissions from all sorts of sources. You're probably going to be bored to death with this over the next few weeks. But what we're trying to do, what governments are trying to do, is to agree an average increase in global temperature of 2 degrees centigrade. Now this actually matters in a flooding context. It's actually, we're not really agreeing 2 degrees centigrade. We're really trying to agree what climate scientists think is a 60% chance of maintaining a 2-degree rise in average temperature. So there's some uncertainty in that. If we do succeed in that, if we keep the temperature change to 2 degrees, the likely risk of flooding in the UK overall is going to get increased by 50%. Okay, half as much again, the risk. I'll look at this in a minute, how that plays out over the country. If we miss that target and it goes up to 4 degrees, so 2 degrees, it's going to be half as much again. 4 degrees, it's going to be probably 150% increase. So it's going to be 2.5 times what it is now. If we go to 6 degrees, which is the kind of runaway scenario, the consequences are just unbelievable. The risk of flooding goes up by something like 6-fold, and that's why everybody's calling it the last tango in Paris. This is a really serious issue. Now, we've got a lot of people working on hydrological and flood research in the UK. I put these pictures up, some of them, and you'll see their research in a minute. They're remarkably young, I think, which makes me a bit alarmed. But anyway, we haven't yet detected, I should say, a significant trend in extreme flood flows in the UK. We do know something about the change in flood flows, and I'll come back to those in a minute. But what we do know is that changes are being experienced differentially across the country. Some risk might be increased 3 times. A risk might be 3 times as much increased in one place as in another. So big regional differences. And again, sea level, that's another thing. Sea level's likely to increase as well because the ocean is warmer, the water is less dense, therefore it occupies more space, sea level rises. We're expecting about another 0.5 metre in the next few years. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Even without any additional storminess, that would make 200 kilometres of our coastal defences very, very vulnerable. And you have to bear in mind, you only need one breach for there to be a problem. One mistake. So that's 20% of our current sea defences, about 300,000 houses, subject to something like the events of 1953 in Essex. So we have to be able to assume we're going to maintain all of that forever, perfectly. Okay? Now, let me just show you something about the research. We've got research on identifying where water was after flooding. And you remember I said this was one of the uncertainties. Where is the water? So we've got here examples of using aerial photography, which is temporary, it has to be specially flown. We've got, by contrast, radar imagery. The black areas here are areas that were flooded in the Thames, in the River Severn, and that's the Tewkesbury area. We've got a whole variety. This is people trying to predict how water transmits down a river channel. This is again the Severn, using photography, or radar in this particular case, a time sequence. So as we go from left to right, we've got different dates. This is the water level falling away, the dark areas shrinking. But they're trying to use a particular mathematical model to predict that in a known event. So if you can get it right in a known event, you can use the same mathematical model in unknown events then, if you know how it works. So trying to find out how it works. We've got things like this where we're actually looking at the characteristics of the shape and size of the river channel and what's happening on the riverbank. So this is again using radar data. We've got examples here of building some of these sources of data together, but building in the effects of observations taken by citizens. Now this is a particularly interesting one here. We've got what I would call citizen science in action here. The black dots, which you can just see around the edge of the map here, are observations that were taken by ordinary people. They took a photograph on their mobile phone of what had happened. And somebody has brought all of those together and tried to tie them up, you see the dots here, with the edge of the floodable area in their mathematical model that they developed. Okay? And you can see here, they turned that into, for this particular event, which is somewhere in the north of England, I can't remember which one it was now, the red areas are highly likely to flood, and in this particular instance, the yellow areas were which more less likely to flood, but they did, in fact, flood, because that's verified by the black dots from what we can call citizen science. It's an army, if you like, of usually rather elderly people going around with mobile phones taking pictures. That's great, of course. It's a really useful thing. We've got examples where those scientists are building models and trying to make them available interactively. So this is an example that runs on the web of, it's the 100-year flood in Mexborough, based on some data from Mexborough. And you can see there that the statistical nature of this. So the blue area is the 1 in 100-year event. There's a 92% chance that the 1 in 100-year event will be larger than that. Okay, now this is where probability gets really complicated. If you go to the next slide, there's an even bigger area. There's a 5% chance that the 1 in 100-year event will be bigger than that. Okay, so if we go back, there's the smaller event. So it's almost certain that the once in 100-year event will be bigger than that, and there's a small chance it'll be bigger than that as well. Now that should be indicating where you might build or buy your house. And you can build those kind of things up to make a map like this of probability using a sequence of, remember, uncertain data, uncertain mathematical models, uncertain data about all sorts of elements, both the physical world and the human experience, dealing with the physical nature of water, the areas that actually flood. You can build models that start to show for particular grid sizes or particular resolutions, increases in flooding. There's the town that's being looked at. This is a 1 in 30-year return period event. Here's an estimate of the 1 in 100-year return period event, and the 1 in 1,000 year return period event. So more and more getting flooded, more and more areas getting flooded. Now, I can't take you through the maths of how this works. It's incredibly complicated, and basically you have to build together a series of models. You have to start with perhaps rainfall model. This is a national scale analysis. You start off with the rain, you try to model something about flows. This is for a 20-year, once in 20-year event, and then you make some estimate of flood risk. You can also try and do it by generating rainfall data and routing it through down channels, and again you end up with some kind of risk map. Now, the point about that I want to say here is that the UK science here is absolutely stunning. It's one of the areas that we are really good at in this country. So we're good at taking the basic data, radar or whatever it is, getting imagery, building an elevation model, what the ground surface shape is like, simulating with maths what it looks like, routing the water through it, validating with what actually happened, and ending up with a map showing flood risk, which we can use. And that is indeed what the Environment Agency use and put on their website, something like this for Tewkesbury. Now, the problem with all of this is that climate change thing. I beg your pardon, that's the Canvey Island map, which clearly indicates that Canvey Island will flood in a 50-year event. The black hatching on the diagram indicates that it is protected by barriers around the coastline. So, in theory, if those barriers go, it's not protected, but it's protected. Okay, now, we can also do some fancy stuff predicting floods at different times, at quite short periods of time. So the top map there is flooding at midday, and then later on in the afternoon, only 5 hours later, we've got more water. The darker blue areas have also flooded. So we're getting pretty damn good at this. This is research from Newcastle University. The problem is what we do about it in terms of what we call adapting to it and mitigating against it. Because what we do, as we've already said, in one place affects what happens somewhere else. And all the time we are spending some money on building barriers, building bypass channels and so on, which is actually affecting the situation that we're trying to model. Now, those are, how we do that, those are political decisions and not scientific ones. So we have to build in the uncertainty associated with that. Now let me finish off really with the climate change bit. Central England, we know Central England is warming. I already mentioned this. We've got anomalies in temperature. You can see here the period from 1780. We've got some of the longest climate records in the world. You can see that hot period at the end here. And this year is actually set to be the hottest year on record, I believe. We're not at the year end yet. But we've got that. We've got this differential change in surface temperature that's already occurring and is likely to continue. We've got relative change in rivers, in river discharges. Now, just very quickly, the blue on the map here in the UK indicates some change in level of the 100-year event forecast to take place before the end of this century. Okay, very difficult and very uncertain. Now, the report that I mentioned has actually tried to capture some of that in a much more direct way for the UK. And I'm just going to show you a couple of the images that come from this and flag up for you the key issues in establishing the level of risk. Now, what they looked at here is the 1 in 75-year event. So once in 75 years. So what we see in the diagram here is what the situation is now. This is the number of residential properties at risk of flooding once in 75 years, and there's a key up there. The darker the colour, the more properties are at risk. And what we've got here is the 2 degrees, 4 degrees, and 6 degrees, or H++, something horrific, let's say, for 2050 and 2080. So let's take 2080 and 4 degrees, and we can see here, country here, the darker the colour, the brown colour here, is the percentage increase in residential properties at risk of flooding from that 1 in 75-year event. And it's around about, if you look on the key, it's around about 100 or 200% increase in those central England areas, based on the latest science. I won't go through all of these in detail, but this is the same kind of picture for the number of people at risk, based all on local authority data. In this case, assuming no population growth. That's a controversial subject in its own right. And it also assumes that we carry on more or less at the same rate doing stuff to mitigate. The effect on deprived people in Britain is greater than on the average person. This is the damage, the way the damage falls out, and I just draw your attention to this one over here. With runaway climate change in 2080, we're talking about a 500 to 1,000% increase in the amount of damage that we will experience from flooding. So these are very, very serious. I'll switch over to some of these. This is high population growth built in. It gets even worse. Okay. And we've got sea level change. That's what we've seen already, sea level going up. That's what's likely to happen if we took a 200-year return period and a tidal surge and 2 examples of sea level rise, both very high. Those are a bit of fun, really. 4 metres is not likely to be 4 metres, but you can see that nasty black area around the Thames. Now, there's North Kent. I wouldn't be buying a house in any of those areas, and I wouldn't be buying a house in Peterborough either. Sea level change is complicated. Let's leave those. And we know about population increase. Sorry, this has flowed off the bottom of the diagram, but population is going up as well. An awful lot of rubbish is being talked by politicians. Nobody gets it right. We're just not communicating this properly. But let's end with London. What's going to happen in London, which is the question I posed at the beginning? Well, this is the floodable area that's being predicted for London. There are huge areas likely to be underwater, huge areas, and we could name all of them, but I'm not going to. This is a summary of the expected annual damages in London. So here's where we are now. The damage, the estimated annual damage for North London and Hertfordshire, £19 billion a year by the 2080s. Now, and 33 billion in the south. If we go, though, to the 2-degree change, you start to see some really big figures. These are annual figures for those areas. If you go to 4 degrees, you're getting eye-watering figures. Okay? Well, they may or may not be true. Let's just say, what would this actually look like? What would actually happen? And remember, one of the risks for London is coastal. Okay, now, that's a simulation, obviously, of London in the event of an extreme tidal surge. I'm not guaranteeing that's what will happen, but the last point I want to make, oh yeah, there's the House of Commons in 1953. The last thing I want you to end up with is this. This is some research that was done in Japan quite recently about underground shopping malls. This is a diagram that shows the depth of water and the velocity of water in which you can stand up. And what it's saying is that for people like me, if the water's more than, let's say, 30 centimetres deep, and it's flowing at more than a metre per second, you can't stand up. It's very difficult to get out. If you're a man, you're probably okay. It's a bit higher, a bit deeper. You can probably push that a bit further. This is what happened recently in Osaka in Japan. A lot of rainfall, very quickly runoff developed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a map of death. This is what would happen, simulated in an underground shopping mall. The redder and darker the images, this is where people cannot get out, particularly elderly Gresham professors, in time before the water arrives. And I'm going to leave you with that as you attempt your journey home on the London Underground. Thank you very much.